I can still feel the chill of that Monday in March when I walked into the lobby and saw my name on the new directory board. The letters were crisp, the title longer than it needed to be, and for a moment it felt like the building itself was nodding at me. I had driven in before dawn, as usual, and the security guard gave me that small smile he reserved for people he considered serious. Back then, I believed seriousness was the whole point. If I could be the one who arrived first, answered fastest, and carried the most, I would become unshakable. That morning, I poured coffee that tasted like metal because I didn't have time to care. My phone buzzed with a calendar that looked like a wall, and I felt a strange pride in how little white space there was. Finance, legal, a client who liked to raise his voice, and a team check-in I'd labeled alignment, even though I knew we were all just trying to breathe. I told myself the pressure meant I was finally important. I told myself the next level would bring ease. I didn't notice how quickly my body learned to live in anticipation. I walked the halls already preparing for objections that hadn't been spoken yet. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny because being liked felt practical. I carried a notebook that was more armor than tool. At home, I kissed my wife on the cheek and said, "Big week," like it was a weather report. She asked if I could come to dinner with her sister on Thursday, and I answered without checking my face, "I'll try." I believed trying was the same as choosing. Now I understand "I'll try" became a habit that trained the people I loved not to count on me. I didn't mean to become that man. I thought I was building something sturdy. The truth is I was building a version of myself that could withstand work, but not much else. By Friday, when the client signed and my team clapped in the conference room, the relief lasted 10 minutes. Then my mind moved on, already hunting the next threat to what I'd earned. That's when the career started to feel less like a ladder and more like a treadmill, and I kept running anyway. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The next year turned into a blur of airports and fluorescent hotel breakfasts. I remember one Tuesday in October, standing in a rental car lot under a low gray sky, scrolling emails with my suitcase handle digging into my palm. My phone said 6:12 a.m. in that city, but my body still felt like it was somewhere else. A presentation in 2 hours, dinner with executives after that, then a quick stop in the office the next morning before flying home. I believed being needed in many places was proof I was becoming indispensable. In the boardroom, the long table was polished enough to reflect my hands when I laid them flat to steady myself. People listened when I spoke. They nodded at the numbers on my slides. Someone said, "You always come prepared," and I felt that small hit of satisfaction like cold water. I had trained myself to chase that feeling. On the flight back, I edited decks while the seatbelt sign was on because the next meeting was already waiting. I told myself that if I kept delivering, the system would reward me with stability, maybe even peace. The reward at home looked like a dark house because everyone was asleep when I arrived. I set my keys down softly and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. There were nights I stared at the family photos and felt like I was looking at people I should know better. My wife would leave a note that said, "Food's in the fridge," and I read it like it was a kindness instead of a signal. When I did see her, my mind stayed half in the office, rehearsing arguments that hadn't happened yet. Now I understand I was learning how to leave without actually going anywhere. Even when I sat at the kitchen table, I wasn't really there. I stopped asking my son about school because the answers took time, and time felt like something I had to defend. I told myself I was providing, and that providing excused absence. Then one evening, my wife said quietly, "You're here, but you're not really here." And I realized I didn't know how to argue with her, because she wasn't accusing me, she was describing me. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The first crack showed up during a celebration that should have felt like a peak. It was a Friday night in early June, and the company rented out the top floor of a downtown restaurant. City lights bounced off the windows and made everything feel cinematic. My name sat on a small card at the head table. My boss clinked his glass and talked about growth, leadership, and the kind of drive you can't teach. People applauded, and I smiled the way you're supposed to smile when you're being praised in public. I believed the recognition would settle something inside me, like a key turning in a lock. I watched my wife across the room, dressed up, polite, careful. She smiled when our eyes met, but it didn't reach all the way. I told myself she was just tired. I told myself we'd talk after things calmed down. I told myself that because it was easier than admitting I didn't know how to calm down anymore. Later, near the hallway that led to the bathrooms, a colleague pulled me aside. He'd had a few drinks, and his voice was looser than usual. He said, "Man, you've got it figured out," then paused and added, "Just don't end up like me." I laughed, thinking it was a joke, but he didn't laugh back. He stared at the carpet and said, "I don't know my kids anymore." Then he patted my shoulder and walked away as if he hadn't said anything. I stood there too long, feeling like I'd been handed a warning in plain language. On the drive home, my wife didn't talk much. The car was quiet except for the hum of the tires. At a red light, she said, "Oh, I'm proud of you." And after a beat, "I miss you." The light turned green and my hands tightened on the wheel. I believed I could fix it with a vacation, a better schedule, a promise. I didn't yet understand I had built my life around not being available. And availability isn't something you install at the end. It's something you practice every day, or you lose it. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. I tried to fix it the way I fixed everything, with a plan. In late August, I blocked off a week on the calendar and told my team I'd be unreachable. I booked a cabin near a lake, thinking quiet water would reset me. The first morning there, the sun came through the pine trees in clean, angled light. My son skipped stones and laughed when they bounced twice. My wife sat on the porch with a mug of tea and watched us like she was holding something fragile. I believed that if I stopped long enough, the rest of my life would rush back into place. But even on that porch, my thumb kept reaching for my phone. I told myself I was checking just in case. I told myself I was preventing problems. The truth is, I didn't trust anyone else to hold the machine together, and I didn't trust myself to sit still. On the third day, a client messaged about a contract detail. I answered quickly, then another came, then another. By evening, I was inside at the small kitchen table, laptop open, while my family played cards without me. Their laughter came through the wall, and instead of joining, I felt irritated that it distracted me. My wife stepped in and stood behind me. She didn't yell. She didn't even sound angry. She said, "Do you realize you're choosing this right now?" I stared at the screen as if it could defend me. I wanted to say, "I have to," but the cabin was proof I didn't. I was doing it because it was familiar, because it made me feel in control, because it gave me an identity I didn't have to question. I believed control was safety. That night I went outside alone. The lake was dark, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine. I realized I didn't know what to do with a life that wasn't optimized. In the office, I could measure myself by output. Out here, all I had was myself, and I felt strangely empty. I promised myself I would do better when we got back. I meant it. I just didn't see that I was promising change while keeping the same center. If work stayed the sun, everything else would keep orbiting, and orbiting isn't the same as living. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The breaking point didn't arrive as an explosion. It arrived as a quiet moment in a fluorescent hospital hallway. It was early December, and I'd been there since midnight because my father collapsed at home. Nurses spoke in calm, efficient voices. Machines beeped. I stood by a vending machine with a paper cup of coffee and stared at a wall covered in no smoking signs. My phone kept lighting up with work messages. The world didn't stop because my father was behind a curtain. I believed I could keep both worlds running if I just handled it. I stepped into a stairwell and took a conference call while the hospital air smelled like antiseptic. Someone asked about a budget revision, and I answered like nothing was happening. I lowered my voice when a doctor walked past, as if the only inappropriate thing was being overheard. After I hung up, my hands shook. I told myself it was lack of sleep. I told myself it was stress. I didn't admit it was something deeper. A part of me was finally revolting against being ignored. When I went back in, my father was awake, pale but clear. He looked at me and said, "You don't have to do all that," meaning the calls, the urgency, the constant posture. I tried to smile. I said, "It's fine," my favorite word for everything. He nodded slowly and said, "I used to say that." Then I looked up and realized I'd spent my best years somewhere else. It wasn't advice. It was confession, delivered without drama. Now I understand the hospital was the first place I couldn't convince myself I was winning. Titles didn't soften the smell of disinfectant. Metrics didn't comfort my father. I sat in a plastic chair and watched him fall asleep, and I realized I didn't know how to be a son without also being a worker. On the drive home, the highway was nearly empty, the sky still dark. I felt like I'd been running for years and had suddenly stopped, not because I chose to, but because my body forced me to. And once I stopped, I could finally hear how tired I was. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. After my father came home, I tried to return to normal, but normal didn't fit the way it used to. I would sit in meetings and hear my own voice talking about deliverables, while a different part of me watched from the corner of the room. In January, during an all-hands update, I stood at the front with a microphone clipped to my collar, looking out at rows of faces. I said the practice things, and people nodded. Then someone asked a simple question about priorities, and my mind went blank, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I didn't believe in it anymore. I believed doubt was dangerous. Doubt could slow momentum, and momentum was what I depended on. So I pushed harder. I stayed later. I answered faster. I tried to outrun the feeling that something was off. Then the body started speaking in quiet ways. One afternoon in February, I stood at the copy machine waiting for pages I didn't need when my chest tightened and my vision narrowed. The room felt a few inches away. I leaned on the counter and told myself to breathe like it was a small, manageable glitch. A coworker asked if I was okay, and I said, "Yeah, just didn't sleep." No one argues with that. I went to my car and sat with both hands on the steering wheel, not turning the key. The parking lot was bright and ordinary, and I realized I was afraid of going back inside. That wasn't like me. I had always been the person who walked toward pressure. In that moment, Pressure felt like a door I had locked myself behind. That weekend, my wife and I sat at the kitchen table after dinner. She didn't talk about my schedule. She asked, "Do you even like your life?" I wanted to defend myself with achievements, with the story I'd told for years. Instead, I stared at the grain of the wood and realized I didn't know how to answer quickly. I believed admitting I was lost would make me smaller. Now I understand it was the first moment I told the truth out loud. I said, "Ayog, I don't know who I am without it." And the room went quiet in a way that felt terrifying and honest at the same time. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The next months were awkward in a way I wasn't used to. I had spent years being competent and decisive, the person with answers. Suddenly, I was the person learning. In April, I asked a colleague I trusted to take over a major account. I remember standing in his doorway with the blinds half open, sunlight slicing across his desk. I said the words carefully, like they could break. "I need you to lead this." He looked surprised, then pleased, then cautious. He asked if everything was all right. I told him, "I'm adjusting some things," which was the only language I had for it. I believed letting go would make me irrelevant. My identity was wrapped around being the bottleneck. If I wasn't the final decision, who was I? But as the weeks passed, nothing collapsed. In fact, people stepped up in ways I hadn't made room for. I watched meetings run without me, and the world kept spinning. That was humbling, and it hurt more than I expected, because it proved my importance had been a choice, not a law of nature. At home, the changes were small at first. I came to the table without my phone. I asked my son questions and waited for the answers. One evening we sat in the driveway with the garage door open, fixing a bicycle chain that kept slipping. Grease got on my hands and I felt oddly present, like my senses had returned. My son talked about a teacher he liked, and I realized I had missed entire seasons of his thoughts. I believed I was catching up. Now I understand you don't catch up the way you catch up on email. You show up again and again and let trust rebuild at its own pace. There were nights my wife still watched me like she was waiting to see if I'd disappear. I didn't blame her. I had trained her expectations. In May, I took my father to a follow-up appointment and sat beside him in the waiting room. He pointed at an older couple holding hands and said, "That's what lasts." He didn't say it like a lesson. He said it like a man finally noticing what he should have protected. I believed I could fix the past by being better in the present. Now I understand the past doesn't need fixing as much as it needs acknowledging. One afternoon I sat in my car before pulling into the driveway and looked at my ordinary house. For the first time in years, ordinary didn't feel like failure. It felt like a place I could finally return to. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. I didn't quit in a dramatic blaze. I didn't write a manifesto or storm out. I simply began to choose differently, and over time those choices added up to a different life. In September, on a morning that felt almost exactly like that first morning years ago, I walked into the lobby and noticed the directory board again. My name was still there, but the title no longer tightened my chest. I stood for a second, listening to the faint hum of the building, and realized the building had never been the point. I had made it the point because it was measurable. When I was younger, I believed identity was something you earned by collecting proof. Now I understand identity is something you live into when you stop hiding behind proof. That didn't mean I stopped caring about doing good work. It meant work stopped being the only place I could feel valuable. I began mentoring younger people and telling them the truth I avoided. The praise is nice, but it doesn't hold you at night. I said it like someone describing a road he knows too well. At home, the shifts showed up in ordinary scenes. Saturday mornings with pancakes and music playing too loud. Slow walks with my wife through a neighborhood we used to drive past without noticing. The first time she reached for my hand without hesitation, it felt like a quiet victory I didn't know how to measure. My son asked if I could come to a school event, and I said yes, without adding, "I'll try." That single word felt heavier than any promotion because it was a promise I intended to keep. The old reflex still visits sometimes, a late email, a problem that looks urgent, the familiar itch to prove myself. But now I recognize the itch for what it is, fear dressed up as responsibility. I can feel it without obeying it. I can step away and return to the room where my life actually happens. I think about my father in that hospital bed and how plain his regret sounded. I don't want mine to arrive stripped of excuses. Losing myself didn't feel like falling off a cliff. It felt like slowly becoming a stranger while everyone congratulated me. Finding myself again didn't feel like a grand discovery either. It felt like coming back to small moments repeatedly until they added up to something honest. When I look back now, I can see the career I built clearly. I can also see the person I almost left behind. And I'm grateful in a quiet way that I finally noticed before the years did it for me. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face. The outside of my life still looked polished, and that made it easier to ignore the inside. People saw the title and assumed the man behind it felt steady. I kept feeding that assumption because it saved me from explaining the truth I didn't want to face.